wanted to start, I just wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me to speak, and I'm also really honored to be amongst many people that are so enthusiastically working on the very topic that's the core of what I do, which is understanding the undeniable intersection between art and science. And so we get to the title of my talk, which is Studying Creativity at the Crossroads of Art and Science. I thought the best way to begin the discussion would be to start with a very simple but telling quote by Miles Davis. Play what you hear, not what you know. Practice, experience, and sheer talent taught Davis that a personally and socially satisfying gig occurs when the ideas entering a musician's imagination are developed through solo improvisations instead of being ignored in favor of over-rehearsed patterns. In other words, and you'd probably agree with me on this, no one wants to pay for and hear a contrived performance. Both the fascination we have with the art of in-the-moment creation and the value we place on it continue to flourish. Take, for example, three well-known contemporary artists, like pianist Keith Jarrett, and vocalist Bobby McFerrin, and the rapper Eminem. All of them make their living off of improvising, and they continue to pack concert venues. Which brings us to the main questions underlying artistic, theoretical, and empirical work on creativity. What is it? Why do we care so much about it? And how do we accomplish such an apparent complex cognitive feat? The literature on creativity and its related topics, intuition, expert knowledge, problem solving, achievement, and so forth, is vast, and the fact of the matter is that it's an interdisciplinary field with perspectives coming from a range of disciplines from philosophy, cognitive science, and to art history. Research on creativity from the psychological perspective, however, is a young science. It really only started to progress after prominent American psychologist J.P. Guilford made a plea for its empirical study during his 1950 presidential address to the American Psychological Association. And despite the later advent of brain imaging techniques in the 90s, the neuroscience of creativity has only very recently begun to harbor interest and pick up pace. And by recently, I mean around 2005, and most directly relate to artistic creativity as opposed to other types of problem-solving tasks. Any empirical work on the topic, however, requires a clear operational definition. The general consensus is that as a prominent characteristic of human intelligence, creativity is a fundamental activity of human information processing. A primary difference between our brains and those of other animals is our capacity to engage in cognitive abilities such as reasoning, representation, association, working memory, and self-reflection. During any creative act, from language production to, say, I don't know, the marketing techniques that are used right now to sell the latest iPhone 5, ideas or past experiences are combined in novel and significant ways via the interaction of such cognitive capacities. And so the current model dominating the neuroscientific study of creative thinking is known as the creative cognition approach. And it basically affirms that creativity is far from a magical event of unexpected random inspiration. Instead, it is a mental occurrence that results from the application of ordinary cognitive processes. Which brings me to talking about perspectives in the art of creation. And now I could walk you through what others have hypothesized and theorized on the topic, but that, I suppose, would be very uncreative. So I will briefly introduce you to what I have learned from my own perspectives as an artist who is constantly creating and as a cognitive neuroscientist studying the neural underpinnings of creativity. As a musician who has learned her repertoire, practiced for hours on end, and performed live, I make explicit, at least from the folk artistic perspective, the intuition that live performance itself is an act of creation. No two live performances can ever be the same. Why? Well, because among other factors, it is precisely the interaction of the musical emotional character evoked and the physical moment of the visual auditory motor sequences that have been memorized, practiced, and now repeated that will, in the moment of realization, take on a novel interpretation. And just as an example of how melody and strong rhythm can evoke a sense of physical movement, which I hope you can imagine how it could put the performer in a position to create a new interpretational line of movement every time. And I'm not saying a drastic change, but certainly a difference. I'm going to play for you just 1 minute of the beginning of a piece from my CD, which I recorded several years ago, of the piece Malagueña by the Cuban composer Ernesto Lecuona. Okay, well, we'll pretend you heard that there was a wonderful movement in the rhythm section that I had in that recording. Which now brings me to creativity as a photographer. Just as the interpretation of music can and will change every time it is performed, so too can and will change the type of photograph to be taken. For me, creating something novel is at the core about defying expectations, be they musical, visual, conceptual, or emotional. My photographs generally fall into two categories: visual illusions within the everyday environment and the expression of human emotions through the face and body. As you can see in this first example, this photograph is from an exhibit I did titled Elusive Spaces in 2009 in a gallery in Baltimore, Maryland. I took the photograph in such a way to make the illusion of a flooded room. I've actually been asked several times whether I literally flooded the room in order to take the picture, because no one seems to believe me that all I used was a single frame, a single exposure, and a mirror. Again, I find myself in a room. I have my equipment. I start making associations with memories of the hallway scenes from Kubrick's horror classic, The Shining, and voila, I get to working on changing what is actually in front of me and produce this. The photograph in this second example is from a series I'm currently working on titled Divided States in black and white film. As with the first example, there are no tricks, no double exposures, no photoshopping, no two models, nothing. All I did was use light, the proper angle, and identify the reflective properties of the present door to capture the seemingly deceptive image. I was going for a dominant, almost eerie glance in the model when I noticed her emotionally opposing reflective image, and then changed everything in the moment so that the reflective image would turn out as it did. A wonderful, explicit visual example, I think, of how emotions are so duplicitous. All right, so the creation of art is a problem-solving process that integrates expert knowledge of the technicalities of the medium at hand, the current intent of the creator, the changing environment in which the artistic product is being produced, and so forth. So how exactly is the brain accomplishing this? That's precisely the question I am interested in investigating as a cognitive neuroscientist who does work in this area. As you can see from my own artistic perspective, I'm particularly interested in the improvisatory nature of creativity because I argue that all creation, even long-term projects, boils down to multiple small moments of improvisation that get aggregated together until the final product is completed. Improvisation, therefore, in terms of cognitive processes, is the spontaneous generation, selection, and execution of novel visual, auditory, motor sequences. And why is musical improvisation such a useful tool for studying the neural underpinnings of spontaneous, creative, artistic invention? Well, like one does with language, musicians must similarly generate a potentially infinite number of contextually meaningful musical phrases by combining a finite set of notes and rhythms, and we can systematically control them in an experimental environment. And furthermore, musical improvisation and appropriate experimental paradigms are relatively easy to do with modern-day brain imaging equipment. What I found out, however, is that very few scientific studies on this topic have actually been done, and they can be divided into the following four categories. The creation of new material, in which there exist 4 studies, and now 5 with the study I'm going to mention in a moment, where musicians generate in the moment simple, novel melodies. There's also the perception of new material, where only one study investigated whether novel material is actually perceived by a listener and not simply assumed. And the last type of study that's been done is the communication of new material, where only one study exists, and that is the one we actually did in our lab, and we investigated the intuition that some sort of a communication is occurring in real time, just as musicians are engaged in a musical conversation as they speak or play with each other. These studies, at a general level, have shown that creating a new material on spot is correlated with increased sensory motor and linguistic cortical activity, as well as decreased activity in prefrontal cortex. In other words, the improviser is basically in a heightened state of an ongoing attention-demanding performance that at the same time incurs on internally motivated, stimulus-dependent behaviors that may only unfold in the absence of cognitive processes that typically mediate self-monitoring and conscious volitional control. Which now brings me to the current study I'm doing in my lab on freestyle rapping. And yes, it's exactly what you're imagining. We actually brought 8 professional freestyle rappers to the lab and had them rap in a functional MRI scanner. Besides having them do a simple word rhyming task, they primarily had to perform a memorized rap, which they memorized prior to coming to the lab, which is there on your left, and they also had to improvise, to freestyle, and the example lyrics are there on your right. So the question really is, which brain areas are uniquely associated with a highly complex generative task like freestyle rapping? Overall, like other generative creative tasks, whole brain analyses reveal intense activation in sensory-motor and language areas in anterior and posterior, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and deactivation in medial prefrontal cortex. Here, too, the improviser, or the freestyle rapper in this case, is in a sort of heightened or prime state as he prepares to execute a highly familiar task, yet with unplanned ideas in a spontaneous context. Furthermore, the attenuation you see here observed in medial prefrontal cortex may be necessary to inhibit any emotional processing that may arise during the creative moment, precisely because the task is so attention-demanding and needs to be completed. Keeping these empirical observations in mind, I would like to end with the first part of a 3-minute film short I made several months ago, exactly with the intent to make explicit the highly task-demanding yet emotionally effective nature of improvisation, musical improvisation, as it merges with the cinematographic medium. I actually completed the visual aspects first, and then I asked a friend of mine, who's a wonderful musician from Peabody Conservatory, to improvise a very simple musical score. I ended up using the first take we recorded, even though we made many. And hopefully, if this sound works, because it is key for this example. Oh.